So, having done the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and emphasized, I hope, both that the Constitution was designed to set up a government that was of the people and that was more had more authority than that of the states. That's actually really quite important, especially in the present. Um, the framers also established the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that created some limits around what the federal government could do, but they did not, the Bill of Rights did not establish individual rights. So, having done that, um, the the for me the fun part of studying American history is always sort of being stuck in the moment of what they were doing. Like, it's not, these are not just like, let's write a document and put it in a vault so that Nicolas Cage can steal it in 200 years, which didn't happen, by the way. Um, Although I love those movies, even though I know I'm not supposed to. The real question is, how do you create a government that enables people to have a say in it? And again, there are all kinds of caveats that I always feel like we need to add, that when the framers, the founders and the framers conceived of self-government, they only meant white propertied men for the most part. And so one of the ways they could conceive of that was they could say, well, we don't have to worry about what women might want or what brown people might want or what black people might want, because they don't count. And so it enabled them to say, yeah, but we all, white guys who have some property, can get along and we can figure out the best way to make the society move forward. So that's really important. And one of the key factors of our history has been trying to make those principles that everybody has a right to say and have a say in their government expand, so that includes women, it includes brown people, it includes black people. And that, of course, has been a key issue for especially white men who didn't want to give up that kind of power, because the vision that some of us have may not be the same one they do. And of course, we're in the middle of that right now. Anyway, for me, the fascinating part is how people try to make a government work that says that everybody can have a say in it. And of course, this task is going to fall to George Washington, who was at the Constitutional Convention. And then when people, and at the Constitutional Convention, when the framers were talking about the concept of an executive, a leader, they had him in mind. I talked about, I think, the fact that he sat on a dais in the front of Independence Hall, which is a very small room, and that is, of course, near where President Biden is going to be speaking tonight. But he sat up there under this starburst that's on the wall. You can see it. And he was constantly a presence. He didn't really talk during the Constitutional Convention, but he was very much there. And the people who put the Constitution in place, when they talked about an executive, he was their ideal, that he was the kind of guy that would fill that seat. And they knew that he wasn't necessarily going to do it forever, although they didn't figure that out. We'll get to that in a little bit, not today, another day. But they had this vision of who he was going to be and what an executive was going to be. So this is going to fall onto him to make this new government exist, to make it work. So he is elected unanimously in the Electoral College, and becomes president. And he's going to take the oath of office in April of 1789. And that's different than other presidents will do it. Generally, until the 20th century, swearing in is in March. And so that's actually going to matter by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century. But right now, he's going to be sworn in April, and he's going to be sworn in New York, because New York at the time is where they think the seat of government is going to be. Because remember, that's not going to be settled for a number of years. And I'm going to talk some about that today. Anyway, he was a really interesting man, Washington, because he's smart enough. He's not an original thinker, but he is able to listen to ideas and make decisions about them. I think I've told you before that what he really wanted above all else before the American Revolutionary War was to be a British officer. He loved the order, he loved the pomp, he loved the orderliness of it. He was an enslaver. He had plantations, or perhaps a plantation is the way to put it, that had enslaved people on it. And when you think about enslavement and the way that played out, one of the ways that it helps me to think about how it looked on the ground, and I think our words don't really give that credit, is as if there is a town of several hundred people, and just like a town, that's town of several hundred people has to have people who know how to farm and people who know how to shoe horses and people who know how to wash things and people who know how to cook and people who know how to do all the things that make a town function. But one guy gets to control everything, and he has the power of life and death over everybody else in that town. And if you think about the fact that we talk about Mount Vernon, for example, as George Washington's plantation, well, okay, he owned it, but he, I think it's a real misnomer to think of plantations identifying them by the enslaver, because that's just, if you live in a small town as I do, imagine that one guy gets to call all the shots. And that's, I think, is an important way to think about some of the early American leaders. They have that kind of extraordinary power in a very intimate, immediate way over their neighbors. These are literally their neighbors. So he has that as well in his mind. And he also, but he really loves living in the country. He doesn't really want to become the leader. He recognizes that he has to do it, or he's going to, the whole experiment's going to fall apart. And that's going to matter in a little bit as well. All right. So he is aware that what he is doing is kind of unprecedented. And at the time when people are talking about putting this government into place, they call it the Great Experiment. You've probably seen textbooks that are titled The Great Experiment, because they don't know if it's going to work or not. And it's going to fall to him to try and make it work. So what he does is this. He is concerned, as lots of people are, that the country is going to fall apart into quarreling factions. It's a huge territory. It's over 850,000 square miles, which is huge for a republic in this era. And he goes to start to govern this land and this government. And it's not even clear what that's going to look like. So he's the president. The vice president is John Adams. He doesn't like John Adams. They're very different kinds of people. And that's going to matter because he's not really going to include the vice president in his decision-making process. And that is going to weaken the vice president well into the late 20th century because he really pretty much ignores John Adams. But then the question arises, who is he going to trust? Who is he going to talk to? And so first he turns to the Senate, because, advice and consent, that's in the Constitution. And the Senate is really jealous of its power. And they're like, dude, we'll get back to you if we feel like we want to talk to you. And so he's kind of like high and dry. Who's he going to talk to? So in the midst of this, he is trying to establish what the government might look like. And he has a problem because, first of all, it's just him. Right now, he doesn't have anyone to talk to. He's going to get somebody in just a minute. I don't mean literally, he's got friends, but in terms of putting together this government. But now his real issue is they declared independence. They fought a war. They had a constitution. Who cares? Like, how do you convince all the other countries in the world that this upstart group of people is legitimate at all? And this is going to be the first issue in his presidency. So one of the things that he's going to do is really to play up sort of the pomp and circumstance of the presidency. So he's going to have a coach with livery, with liveried guys on it and with a coat of arms painted on it. He's going to have very fancy dinners. And he's going to really emphasize the incredible power of this executive. He's going to kind of pretend he's a king. But at the same time, he's not a king, and he knows he's not a king. So at least once a week, he'll walk through the streets like a common guy, literally walk in the streets, not with a horse, but walk in the streets, which is really messy because people spit in the streets and they throw their slops in the streets. And so he's constantly saying that everything that he recognizes, as he says at one point, I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent. And so he's got that going on as well, and that's going to matter in a little bit. All right, so the Constitution itself doesn't really talk about how the government runs. And that's going to be an issue into the 1830s, just so you know. They've set up this beautiful thing on paper, but what does that look like? So, first of all, in this period, it's going to mean they kind of think that the same guys who've always run things are going to continue to run things. And that's why Andrew Jackson's going to be important in the 1830s, because he's like, well, I don't think that's a good idea because I'm not one of those guys. But so that's one way that they can sort of not worry about the fact that what's on the ground doesn't, or on the paper doesn't necessarily meet what's on the ground. But as I said, Washington has to figure out who he can consult when big stuff comes up. And the Senate kind of said, we'll talk to you when we feel like it. So increasingly, he begins to talk to people in the cabinet, people who were told by the Constitution that, or were established by the Constitution. So the Constitution says that there are going to be these different departments, and the Congress sets up 4 departments. It creates the War Department, the Treasury Department, the State Department, and the Attorney General. And those are the first 4 departments of the country, and state is going to be really important. I mean, they all are, but state, and of course, they're going to divide. The War Department's going to get a new name in the 20th century. There's going to be all kinds of changes to this. And what the Attorney General is and what he oversees is going to change in 1870. These are all, and the Treasury is still the Treasury, but that changes a lot in 1861. But state is going to be sort of the most powerful position in the cabinet, more powerful really than the vice president, well into the 20th century, because state is what's going to be the interface between this new nation and other countries. And so it was assumed until really into the 20th century that the stepping stone into the presidency was not the vice presidency, because no one really paid attention to the vice president. It was I mean, to the point that when Teddy Roosevelt becomes vice president, he's so bored he asks the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court if he can go back to law school, and he's like, and the Chief Justice is like, dude, no, you can't. I'll tutor you. And then of course McKinley gets assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt has something to do. But really, no, people aren't paying attention to the vice president. So the State Department becomes the stepping stone, the key stepping stone. And one of the reasons that we know and talk about the State Department people as much as we do is because that was really the lever of power in this early government. So George Washington makes 2 important appointments to those positions that are going to really matter for the way the government develops. First of all, he's going to put Alexander Hamilton at Treasury, and then he's going to put Thomas Jefferson at State. All right, so Hamilton and Jefferson are going to be in what are really the 2 key positions in that cabinet. Now, those 2 personalities are extraordinarily different, and you probably have all seen both of them portrayed in the Hamilton musical, which I still continue to believe is brilliant. But they're also that's a musical. It does have a lot of truth to it, but they're very, very different thinkers, and they have very different power bases, and they have a very different relationship to George Washington and to the way they think about the country, and that's going to matter a lot. All right. So the other thing that's important is that if you remember when I talked about the Constitution, I kind of joked about the fact that when they got to the judiciary, they're like, hey, we're tired. We're not going to bother to write this. Just have some courts. I exaggerated that, but there is the problem, or maybe not a problem. Maybe there is the peculiarity of the Constitution, that it's pretty clear on the legislative branch, the first thing that's set up in the Constitution. It's pretty clear on the executive, the second thing that's set up. It's not very clear at all about the judges, about what's going to happen with the courts. So the Congress sets up a system of federal courts. It's not in the Constitution. The Constitution says that you're going to have courts. It sets up a federal Supreme Court, but it's not clear really what that court is supposed to do other than sort of adjudicate things between the different states. The Congress is what sets up our system of courts. And with the Judiciary Act of 1789, it begins by setting the size of the Supreme Court, which is not in the Constitution. It's one of the things people are talking about now. Our current Supreme Court's limit of 9 justices was established in 1869. The first number of Supreme Court justices was established in 1789, and it was 6 Supreme Court justices. And it set up 13 federal districts, and it set up 3 circuits of appeal. So there were these different layers of how the system worked, and it mattered a lot that in these days you literally rode the circuit. That's why they're called circuit courts. They move around. So that meant that judges and lawyers were pretty young, and because they had to ride in stagecoaches and on horses and all that. And it also meant that many of our early legislators are going to come from within that body of lawyers because they know a lot of people. That's why Abraham Lincoln knows people, is he's ridden the circuit for so long. So he's going into all these towns. Whereas if you were a sheep herder in upstate New York, you're not going to be moving around to all these places. You're not going to know these things. So that movement of justices around the circuit is going to keep the system of judges fairly young, because by the time you don't feel like sitting on a horse, you're just going to step down. And it's going to make the body of our legislators come from the people who are arguing on those circuit courts. Washington, the federal circuit courts review state court decisions, and they also have some original jurisdiction over things that the state courts aren't supposed to look into. All right, so Washington puts into position as our first Chief Justice John Jay. He is not going to be nearly as important as the next one that comes up, but he's our first Chief Justice. And as I say, during this period, the Congress is also in the process of ratifying the Bill of Rights, which I really hope I've talked to you about. All right, so the other important thing about the Bill of Rights that I'm not sure I mentioned when I talked about it was that the Bill of Rights limits the power of the federal government, and I will talk about this a lot in the 1860s. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are the first that increase the power of the federal government, and that's going to matter a lot. All right, so we got the thing set up, and we have this government on paper, and now Washington's starting to make it look like a real government, and almost immediately there's a problem. And the problem is going to stem from the need of the government to raise money. As almost every problem starts in a government, they need money. And they need money for a number of reasons. But the most important reason that they need money is because of the Revolutionary War and the extraordinary inflation after the Revolutionary War, and the fact that both states have gone into debt to pay for their troops during the war, and the government has gone into debt as well. How are you going to repay that? Remember, that was one of the issues with the Articles of Confederation, is a lot of states are like, we're not going to help the federal government pay off its debts. And some states paid off their debts and other states didn't. So Virginia, for example, paid off its debts and Massachusetts did not. So what are you going to do about this? I mean, literally, how are you going to handle this? And this right now is one of the reasons that I've been a fan of Hamilton ever since I started doing history, because it is not only a financial issue, it's an ideological issue. And how Hamilton looks at this, and he turns, what's the word, sow's ear into a silk purse or something, or he turns a bad hand into a good hand. I can't think of the right way to put this. But he looks at the fact this new government that desperately needs to prove to other countries that it's going to exist and that doesn't really know how to function. He looks at this new government and he says, we got a real problem because we're broke and we got to find money. How can we use this for the government? And what he does is he's an interesting character, because you know from the musical he's illegitimate. His father did not marry his mother, and he is from Nevis in the Caribbean, and he's where he was a sort of a down and out kid, and now he's made it to America. Obviously, brilliant guy, made it to the United States, really eager to be part of this new experiment. It's important to him to have this work. He thinks of George Washington almost like a father, fiercely loyal man, but terribly proud, and not really with the in crowd, except that he's trying to get into the crowd. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on with Hamilton, but the reason I make a big deal about that is because his view of the world is much more cynical or realistic than that of some of the other people that he's going to deal with. And what he says is that we need to get rich people behind this government, because unless we got rich people behind this government, it's going to fall apart. And how am I going to get rich people behind this government? Well, the way to get rich people behind a government is to make them put their money into it, to make sure their finances are behind it. That's a really key insight. That is the idea that you must have people with money invest in your government, because then it's to their good to have it exist, is really a key insight. And one of the reasons that I, for example, have looked at the rise of the global elite in the period largely since the 1990s with great concern, because if I'm a gazillionaire and all of my money is in a foreign currency, what do I care if the United States exists, except that I think it might be a good idea? And that is sort of very un-Hamiltonian to do that. So he takes a look at this and he says, we got to get rich people behind this. So here's his plan. He comes up with a plan to tie people's, what he thinks are people's inherent selfishness to the government. This is such a key insight, because often when you think about reform movements in America, which is all I do, maybe it's everywhere, people try and double down on individuals being loving and kind and wanting to do the best thing. I would love for the world to be that way, but it has been my observation at my age that that's great, but that very powerful people sometimes do things for the right reasons, but it's pretty rare. You need to find a way to get their self-interest behind a project. And maybe that's through language, maybe that's through money, maybe that's through, any number of things. But Hamilton saw this early on. He's like, we got to get their self-interest behind this government. So what he says is this. He says, here's what we need to do. We need to fix the credit of the United States because it's in tatters. So what we should do is we should take the federal debt, about $52 million, all that money spent fighting the Revolutionary War, and it's all in all kinds of different debt instruments. And we should pull it all in, kind of like, this is, if I've got an economist out there, your head's going to explode when I say this, but kind of like you got 16 credit cards and one's at 3%, one's at 17%, whatever. It's going to pull all that back together, going to consolidate that debt, and then he's going to put it together with the still outstanding state debts of about $25 million. So Virginia doesn't owe anything, but Massachusetts still has debt. So he's going to take all that state debt that's still out there, and they're going to pull it all together. They're going to pull it all together under the federal government, and then they're going to reissue debt based on that pot of money, so that some rich dude in Massachusetts wants a place to put his money that looks secure. Where's he going to put it? He's going to buy a bond from that new government because it's going to pay interest and it's going to be good for his bank account. At the same time, that then means that his financial interest is tied to the United States government. It is sort of brilliant in its beauty and its simplicity. But Hamilton doesn't stop there. You knew this was coming. He says that for the United States to become powerful, what it also needs to do is to expand American manufacturers, to make it really tie into this idea that Adam Smith has articulated in 1776 with the Wealth of Nations. It's got to have a much stronger manufacturing base and a commerce base in order to become independent of Europe and in order to start exporting things itself. And so he wants to start investing the United States funds into the development of things like manufacturing. All right, so how is he going to pay for this? He's going to pay for it by establishing taxes. And he's going to put taxes on what is, I'm kind of obsessed with tax policy, but he's going to put taxes on things that are considered luxuries, and he's going to put taxes on people who are not really tied into the federal government. And this is going to be a problem because what he puts taxes on primarily is whiskey. And that's going to explode in his face in a hurry. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So this seems like just a great idea. You know, the new certificates based on that debt that they're going to issue are going to circulate as money. You're going to start investing in creating this strong economy, and you're going to assume all this debt. It's a great idea, right? Except Congress takes one look at this, and Congress is like, first of all, we don't like Alexander Hamilton. He's a jerk. Second of all, what are you talking about? It's creating a debt, a financial debt? The first thing out of the box, you're going to go ahead and put debt in the middle of our system? And third of all, Virginia's paid this off. Why on earth should we assume the debts for Massachusetts? We don't even like manufacturing. We're quite happy down here planting things. Why on earth should we do this? So they argue, they fight, and finally, one of the leaders, of course, against the idea of this is Jefferson and the people in the American South. Finally, Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton have dinner together, and this shows up in the musical as the room where it happened, right? Nobody really knows what they did, except as my friend Joanne says, yeah, we know what they did, actually. They agree to this assumption idea, to the assumption of the debt, and to this new financial pattern if the federal government moves out of Philadelphia, where it's going to be for 10 years, to a new government in the South. And this is how we get the idea of the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, between Virginia and Maryland on the Potomac River. And this is actually going to be great for Washington as well, he thinks. So they do a trade that we're going to get this, what's called funding and assumption, in exchange for Washington, D.C. And that's why Washington, D.C. sets up there. And I hope I remember to tell you more about the establishment of Washington, D.C. All right, so one of the issues, though, with this idea of this funding, this debt, is who's going to manage it? Like, you can't just, what are you going to do? Like, have some guy with a safe? No, you need a bank. And so we're going to have a 20-year charter for the Bank of the United States. And that Bank of the United States is going to be in, I believe it's originally in Philadelphia. You can go see the building there. It's a beautiful building, remarkably small building. But it is going to be dominated by private businessmen. And that's going to be a huge issue in the early 19th century. That Bank of the United States is going to hold federal money. It's going to issue currency for the payment of money to the federal government. And in order to pay for that debt, we're going to have taxes and tariffs that are essentially, they're not really, but essentially taxes on goods coming in from other countries. And theoretically, now everything is just going to be ducky. All right. That's not the way it plays out. All right. Immediately, we're going to have a rupture in the political class over people who had previously all joined together to support the Constitution. They're going to split over funding and assumption. And I'm going to tell you more about that next week. But one of the things you need to remember in this early period, the first 4 years or so of the Constitution, is that maybe more, the first 8 years, 6 years, a few years of the Constitution, is that the framers did not believe that America would have political parties. They believed that because they'd thrown off monarchy, everybody was going to get along and they would be able to argue as factions for or against policies, and those factions would shift. They thought that political parties were dangerous. They called them factions, and they did not think that they were going to exist in America. So that's going to change over the funding and assumption and the establishment of the Bank of the United States. I hope you're with me on this so far. So what happens? So now we've got everything set up. The government's all set to go. Washington's got a cabinet. There's a judiciary. And of course there's Congress. There's money, or there's a system for money. So, how are you going to convince the world to take you seriously if you're George Washington? Well, you could have another war, which is probably not a great idea, but with a foreign power, or you could extend your government's control over the West. And this is a really important piece of the Washington administration that is, I think you really have to understand in order to understand the rest of history up through the War of 1812, which is a really, I'll get to that. It's a really interesting war. But remember what happens. And remember what a big deal I made about the fact that the Treaty of Paris, one of the many treaties of Paris. You know, I always told you if you're on Jeopardy and they say what's the name of a treaty in America before like 1850, just say the Treaty of Paris because there's so many of them. Paris was supposed to be the city of diplomats, so there's a lot of treaties there. Anyway, the Treaty of Paris that ends the Revolutionary War theoretically established American control over an extraordinary amount of Western land. Now, remember, that's indigenous land, but at the same time that that was theoretically the case, the British didn't leave. They, to some degree, pulled back up into Canada, but they also maintained their forts in that area. Because think about it, what were the chances that these quarreling Americans were actually going to be able to pull off this whole idea of a new nation? It's really not obvious yet at all. And the British really, really want those Atlantic ports. They don't care so much about the inner lands. That's fine, but they want Boston, they want New York, they want Philadelphia, they want Charleston, they want all those ports down the Atlantic. And because remember, as I keep saying, I think I keep saying, until after World War II, water is the highway on the globe, not land. You want water and you want ports until World War II and until we get air travel. So that's what the British are really looking for. And at the same time, Spain is not terribly interested in supporting the existence of the United States of America either. And it's going to be trying to claw the Southwest away from the United States of America for a while. So Washington's got the problem with the fact that British have not pulled back away from the Western land, and they're sort of sitting there like, hey, folks, you know, we're happy to take you back. The indigenous Americans also think the idea of the United States moving into their lands is not a great one, and they're willing to ally with the British. And then the Spanish as well are like, hey, we'd kind of like some of that land as well, as long as we're at it. So Washington's got to do something, or he thinks he has to do something, and he's going to make two major, or really three major pushes into the American West. The first is against the indigenous Americans. And it always makes me a little sad that when we talk about US history, people sort of blow right over the early establishment of a relationship between the United States government, which is now being set, and the indigenous Americans, who are very much a political, military, social force, well, really throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, but certainly in this period. So what happens is that in 1789, very early on, the United States government makes treaties both with the Iroquois, who were centered, not entirely, but centered out of the New York area. Their boundaries are very different than the state boundaries are going to be. And with the Miami Confederation, which is 8 tribes that are headed by the Miamis. The United States government recognizes the right of those indigenous Americans to their lands, and it recognizes the right to negotiate as a sovereign power. That's important because previously land had been transferred on an individual basis, and that's a fascinating concept of the right to transfer land, because as a student of mine once put it, the problem with the idea that everybody can trade as individuals is it seems like that's part of a free market until, as she said at the time, this was a long time ago, Michael Jackson ends up with all of the copyrights to all the Beatles songs. So it seems like that would be a fairer system, but what happened, of course, was that the indigenous Americans who were selling on an individual basis ended up losing all their land. So what the government does is to individual buyers, but the effect is Michael Jackson getting all the Beatles copyrights. So What the government does with this purchase is it says, we won't do that anymore. We're going to negotiate with you as a people, not as individuals. And we're not going to go ahead and let land companies, for example, and settlers take you for a ride. It's not the way it plays out, but that's the idea. At the same time, the government is really determined to get Indigenous Americans off that land, and that land that is held by the Iroquois and the Miami Confederacy is incredibly rich land. It's incredibly rich land. It's the Ohio Valley, essentially. All right, so the government quickly clears a lot of that land through this treaty, but north of the Ohio River, the Miami Confederacy refused to back off. It refused to cede its land. And they began to fight. So the Miamis and the Shawnees and the Lenni-Lapes fight, and they defeat the American military in 1790 and 1791. And in 1791, about 600 U.S. soldiers were killed in their attempt to take over that indigenous land. They insisted still on the boundary of the Ohio River as the boundary of white settlement or Euro-American settlement. The British, of course, think this is a great idea, and they encourage the Indigenous Americans to fight the Americans at that point, the United States Americans. But in fact, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, although they have encouraged Indigenous Americans to fight against the United States, they don't step in to back them up. And with the Battle of Fallen Timbers of 1794, it's a really major battle. What happens is the United States, hold on, I'm lost here. The United States forces the Miami Confederacy out of its land, and they break the hold of that Confederacy on the Northwest lands. And in 1795, they force the Indigenous Americans to give up the southern 2/3 of the area between Lake Erie and the Ohio River. That is the largest indigenous land cession at that point in U.S. history. And what that does is it opens up what's known as the Old Northwest to United States settlement. So the Battle of Fallen Timbers, 1794, is a really big deal. And then the Treaty of 1795, which is totally escaping my, the Treaty of, crap. If you were one of my students, you'd know this because I ask it on my IDs every year. I haven't done this in a while. That treaty is a huge deal that opens up that land. All right, so Washington has exerted the power of the federal government over the Indigenous Americans and gotten this huge land grab or land cession from Indigenous Americans, which encourages Americans to move into that land, and that's what's going to be giving us a lot of the settlement in the Old Northwest. But he's also going to push against the Americans in the western part of Pennsylvania who don't like that new whiskey tax that I mentioned. Remember I said how Hamilton was going to want to both tie the taxation to things that were considered luxury items, and usually when people put taxes on things in America until 1861, they put them on liquor first. So it was an obvious thing to tax. And this would also really show people in that western part of Pennsylvania that they were tied to this government, that they owed it something. So they put this whiskey tax on things, but this really hammers people in western Pennsylvania, because in western Pennsylvania, I think I talked to you about the Shelbyville moraine and how this part of the country survives on corn. This part of the country grows corn, and in this period, and the issue with corn is that it spoils very quickly. The sugars in it turn to starches very quickly, and it rots. And the way you preserve corn in these days before freezing and all that is by turning it into whiskey. It's a higher cost product, and it enables you to essentially to get your corn to market. So if you've ever wondered why we have so many whiskeys from Kentucky, for example, it's because that region of the country really grew a lot of corn, and that's how they got it to market, essentially. So by putting a tax on that, by putting a tax on whiskey, Hamilton was really cutting the legs out from under Western farmers. So um, in the Western districts of a lot of states, and especially Pennsylvania, they simply said, forget it. We're not going to pay this. You're really, this is the difference between us being able to stay on our land and not. And so they refused to pay. They were afraid that they were going to lose their lands because of this, and increasingly simply become the tenants of rich men who did, in fact, have enough money to go ahead and pay taxes if they were growing whiskey. So, literally, being able to sell your whiskey meant the difference between being an independent farmer or not. They were quite poor. They start to have a bunch of meetings to oppose the tax and to condemn the taxes, and they protest having to support what they say are rich officials and the national debt. They're furious at the rich landowners who are taking advantage of them. They're mad at merchants. They're mad at what they consider this elite culture coming out of Washington with his livery and all that sort of thing. Not there's the city of Washington yet. I mean George Washington with his livery and all that. And so they start to grumble about this new tax and about this new government. Well, Hamilton and Washington see this, and they think it's a sign of an attack on their government. And this is also an interesting thing if you think about the modern day Tea Party, for example, which was in fact an attack on our government. Washington looks at that, and Hamilton looks at this, and says that this is the moment when we really need to illustrate the power of the federal government. So Hamilton actually said the question was, shall there be government or no government? And Washington himself moves out with 13,000 men. That's more than he had at Yorktown, to put down this rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, in Western Pennsylvania. They meet no resistance at all. They take 20 prisoners who are obscure men. Eventually, 2 of them are convicted of treason, but George Washington pardoned them both on the argument that they were mentally incompetent. It was simply a way, really, for them to show the power of the federal government. They also tried to show their power by negotiating in the West, by negotiating a treaty with Spain for the free navigation of the Mississippi, with the right to deposit goods at New Orleans. But the point that I want to make is that Washington really is facing the problem of proving not only to the country that this government is viable, but also to the rest of the world. So he does it, first of all, by trying to create this functioning government, but also by extending power over the American West. And that's going to have implications, of course, for indigenous history and the indigenous Americans, and also for the relationship between the American East and the American West. All right. The more he does, the more he creates political parties. Or rather, the things he does create the vacuum in which political parties can step in. So, as I told you, the revolutionary generation is terrified of parties. They don't want them. But the idea of political parties is really important, because a democracy really, we get the theory of political parties coming out of this movement, because the theory of political parties, and I'm sure you've heard me talk about this before, but the theory of political parties is that the idea that we all agree on everything is great. It's just also not reality. And what political parties do, and one of the reasons that they enable this government to function, is because political parties set up the idea that if your people aren't in office, you have another set of people that you like, and you can get them in office. And that means that opposition to a government is channeled through established systems. So rather than starting a revolution, you can simply work for a different set of Congress critters, for example. So the existence of political parties, first of all, creates an avenue for people who are not part of the system currently, not people in power, to feel like they have an option going forward, and it's still that they're tied to the system. It also provides oversight for the people who are in power, because unless there is somebody looking over your shoulder all the time, we know now, which again, they didn't at the time, but we know now that one-party states always devolve into corruption because no one's watching. And you can see this in states where one political party or another has had unchecked power for a long time. So my great example of this is always the American South between 1870 or so and 1965, when they held elections. But everybody knew that the people who were going to win them were the Democrats. And what that means is the rule of law breaks down because nobody is standing over your shoulder going, hey, wait a minute, what did you do with that amount of money? And again, you could see this, for example, with the PPP loans under the Trump administration. I was just reading about this the other day. When Congress originally wrote the law under which those were handed out, they insisted on there being congressional oversight of the way that money was spent, and Trump gutted that, so there was no oversight. We know now that a lot of that money went to the places it shouldn't have gone, and all sorts of things. You want to have, and you hear me talk about this all the time, you want to have two healthy political parties, not just because it sounds good on paper, but because it stabilizes the system by letting people think that they have an option going forward to put their own people in power. It stops corruption because there is oversight, and what's the third thing about political parties? Those two things will do, I guess. Anyway, political parties, having healthy political parties, stabilizes democracy, and they needed political parties, but they didn't know that at the time. Let me just do a little bit of a deep dive here. The idea of legitimate political parties is a fascinating one, because if you think about when America rose as an entity and what happened before that, it hasn't always been a thing that you're able to have somebody who disagrees with the government, and in a lot of places you still can. But the idea that you could not like the king or queen, but still be loyal to the country rises in the late 1600s and early 1700s in Britain. So the idea that you can agree with the country but not agree with the king or queen, I mean, you used to lose your head over that, or end up in the tower, or end up in pieces, or all sorts of things. They begin to articulate the idea that the government needs to have an opposition party because it enables people to avoid corruption. It gives people an avenue to believe that they have an option in taking over power. And here's the third piece I couldn't think of a second ago. It hones people's arguments. I mean, you want to have to defend your arguments, which is one of the things I think is interesting about political discourse nowadays, that people seem to want to make pronouncements and not argue about them. And I feel that way actually about intellectual arguments as well. I actually like to argue about things because I learn a lot and it hones my arguments. I'm not always right by any stretch of the imagination, but you get to a better position, I think, when people say to you, wait a minute, what about this? What? And sometimes people write to me and they say, well, I don't want to be contrarian, but that's never unwelcome to me, because it always, 100% of the time, makes me stop and think. I don't always change my mind, but I would bet I change my mind 80% of the time. So anyway, that's the other thing that political parties do, is it says to you, wait a minute, we need to talk about this because I think you've missed something crucially important. And just as a modern day example, you can see this, for example, with the trigger laws that so many Republican states have put in place, and that recent legislator, I forget from what state, but who was all over the news because he said, I just had no idea that women were going to die from this, and that people were going to, lose their uteri, or lose a uterus, and they were going to, babies were going to die, and women were going to, I just had no idea. Well, he would have known if there'd been a real debate about those things, because people who were deeply involved in the issue of reproductive choice have been making that argument all along, but he was in a closed system, so he didn't hear that. Anyway, they didn't expect this. Did somebody just call me a communist? Yeah, I hope I read that wrong. Anyway, so they didn't believe there were going to be parties. And in fact, Jefferson at one point actually says, if I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go at all. And I have this joke, this long-running joke with my dear friend Joanne, that I don't like Jefferson. And of course, he's such an important thinker. And I really don't like Jefferson. he's such an important thinker. She's always sort of saying, well, we have to take this back to Jefferson. But one of the reasons I don't like him is I don't like people who say one thing and do another. So Jefferson says, if I couldn't go except by party, I wouldn't go at all. But in fact, he's one of the key movers in the establishment of American political parties. So at first, the framers think they're not going to need political parties because they're going to rely on the idea that people are people, yes, but also lawmakers are virtuous. That a republic is going to create virtuous people. And interestingly enough, the way that they think a republic is going to create virtuous people, and they construct this idea at the beginning when women start to say, hey, wait a minute, if everyone's created equal, what about us? They actually start to flirt a little bit with the idea that women can be independent political actors. And then they're like, nah, we disagree with that because that really upends everything if women get to be independent actors. What are we going to do with personal relationships between men and women? So instead, the way that we are going to incorporate women into this idea of having a say in their government is by letting them be the people who train children into being virtuous. So they can be members of this republic by virtue of the fact that they're moms. So we get the concept of the Republican mother. And those early framers start to say, well, lawmakers are going to be virtuous. The people are only going to elect people who are virtuous and who have principles in which they're trying to do what's best for everyone and in which they are pure and moral. And again, this is quite contrary to the way Hamilton, for example, thinks about the government. And I think, as you can tell from the establishment of political parties pretty quickly, that's not the way it played out. Because what happens is that quickly in America, we get the development of political parties quite broadly splitting over the idea of the Funding and Assumption Act and over Washington's determination to strengthen the federal government. Because Washington, as I say, is trying to prove that this government is real. And he's doing it with things like the trappings of the monarchy. He's doing it by pushing into the West, by leading an army, by doing this big treaty with the indigenous Americans to the West. He's doing it, which is really kind of an in-your-face thing to have done to the British who are pushing back the other way. He's doing it in ways that if you disagree with things like the assumption and debt, or that you disagree with the idea of centering money in Philadelphia, for example, among a bunch of merchants, if you're against that, you look at what Washington is doing and you start to say, crap, we just went to war to get rid of monarchy. And now we got this dude that we elected turning into a king. Like, what's with that? Meanwhile, us here, us people primarily in the American South, who don't like the idea of the merchants running everything and don't like the idea of this debt because we don't like the taxes that it involves, we're the ones who really believe in the idea of this new government, in the republic, and in the idea of self-government. As I have said a million times, that is enormously ironic, because one of the things that will have happened after the establishment of the Declaration of Independence and then the Constitution is that the northern states are going to get rid of human enslavement as a part of their legal code. There's going to be, that's just some wiggle room in there with apprenticeship laws, but it's going to be the American South, of course, that doubles down on the idea of human enslavement, especially after the invention of, or the patenting of the cotton gin, the cotton engine after 1793. So at the same time, they're like, we're the ones down here who are protecting the concept of the republic. They are literally the people who are enslaving their neighbors. And that is going to turn into a continuing problem in our American polity over what democracy and what having a say in your government really means. So from that point, that's going to develop into a fight on the side of the Southern enslavers who say, we don't want any part of this whole government debt and this whole manufacturing and this whole idea of trade and commerce. We don't want any part of that. That's the federal stuff. We don't like that. We believe that having a say in your government means state government that does not have to pay into this federal government, because our system is the most pure form of government. Because down here in the states, in the southern states, we can control that. We don't have to deal with the federal government. So at the same time that they are establishing the idea of human enslavement as a part of their continuing legal system after the establishment of the cotton gin, they are also saying, but we're actually the real guys who know how the country is run. It's run by the states. It all has to come down to the states. And the reason that I'm emphasizing that right now is because, of course, this is the exact same freaking fight that is going on in America right now, where a number of right-wing activists are trying to dismantle the federal government, things like the Roe versus Wade decision from the Supreme Court of 1973, I'm sorry, and replacing it with the Dobbs decision, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health of June 2022, that throws everything back to the states. Their focus is on the states. When you hear now about the attempt of a number of state governments to take over the ability to choose electors, or even to call a constitutional convention and write a new constitution that will decimate the federal government, this is the argument that you're hearing from the very beginning of American history, which is why people like me think it's so freaking cool. All right, so how does this play out? It plays out, first of all, with the fight over funding and assumption. And crucially, with that fight over funding and assumption, Madison breaks with Washington. He breaks with the administration. I'm going to tell you a lot more about Madison in the future. He compromises over having the capital in the South, but he loses it over the establishment of the Bank of the United States. Both Madison and Jefferson are like, we are totally out of here. They get more strident and they start to argue for a strict construction of the Constitution, saying you can't do this. Where is it in the Constitution that you can do this? And it's important to remember that the notes we have of Madison's recollections of the Constitutional Convention are from this later period, not from that earlier period. They start calling for a strict interpretation of the Constitution because they're trying to undercut Hamilton. They don't want that bank. They don't want this new system that Hamilton is coming up with. And George Washington decides in favor of Hamilton. He decides that under the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, that is, the government can do what is necessary and proper, the government can expand with the country, because he recognizes that if it does not, the government is going to die. In 1791, then, after the establishment of the Bank of the United States, those people who disagree with the idea of the power that is being assumed by the government to set up this bank, to assume the debt and to set up this bank, they start to organize along the lines of the same sort of concept of the Republican interest, the country party in Britain before the Revolutionary War, the one that the founders looked to articulate an ideology of an American revolution. So they begin to call themselves a Republican interest, and by 1792, they are calling themselves a National Republican Party, which they see themselves as this virtuous country party against this federal government, which they believe is corrupt. It is using the government for its own interests, and they start to articulate this system of parties by which they, the Southern enslavers, are the real heart of American democracy. Really important point here, this is not the modern day Republican Party. The modern day Republican Party, when it forms in the 1850s, takes that name Republican because they're trying to pull forward the idea of some of the ideas, but they are absolutely not the same thing. That really is going to matter when we get to the 1850s. We need some new names in this country. Anyway, they are actually a number of different organizations, different groups that come together. They're not really a party yet, but they begin to argue that they are the heart of democracy, that they are the common men. Again, they're being articulated by Jefferson and Madison, who are enslavers, wealthy men who are enslavers, but they begin to argue that they're the common man and that they have this profound faith in democracy. And they're able to argue for this profound faith in democracy in part because they've enslaved most of the impoverished people around them. The idea that everybody is equal is possible because they have enslaved so many Black and Indigenous Americans, and as well because they're not including they're not including women either. So what they are, in a sense, is a group of people who are already basing their concept of what it means to be an American on a myth, if you will, on highfalutin language that is tied to an ideology, but that is not one that is going to be tied to, in which that language is going to be tied to reality. That's going to play out over the next several years, and I will fill you in on that. Probably not next week. I will let you know. But I just wanted to get back in the swing of this because, as you know, the history is my happy place. The rest of it I do because I think it's so important in this moment for people like me to be engaged in this moment. But I miss the history. So I really appreciate you all being here and willing to let me play. Again, anyway, this is what I was trying to do and have been trying to get to for a month, how George Washington and the original framers of the Constitution had to figure out how to create a nation that was strong enough to be taken seriously by other countries. It's not yet in this moment. We're going to get to that. But how they did that and how they made people at home take it seriously by funding the debt, for example, and how that almost out of the box is going to create a fundamental split in the concept of American democracy that we are still grappling with today. All right, thank you for being here. I got to get back to work. This is fun.